Over the summer, I completed a 3-month internship at the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office. During my time there, I worked mainly with the National Register Coordinator. My responsibilities consisted of finalizing 5 National Register nominations for historic properties along Route 66, including 2 bridges, 1 historic district, 1 road segment, and about 20 Flagstaff motels. I also created a National Register nomination for the Madonna of the Trail Monument in Springerville, Arizona, which is one of 12 identical statues that commemorate women that traveled west along a road system known as the National Old Trails Road. In addition to working on National Register nominations, I conducted a survey of the Oakland Historic District, a Phoenix subdivision that the SHPO is considering removing from National Register status, and I worked with or shadowed all of the members of the SHPO. I also attended the Historic Preservation Conference, a traditional cultural properties conference in Mesa, the Historic Sites Review Committee meeting, and staff and archaeology task force meetings. My work on the Route 66 National Register nominations provoked a lot of questions for me throughout my internship. Prior to moving to Flagstaff last year, I have never spent any time near Route 66, and none of my family has traveled along that highway, so all of this emotional baggage attached to it is a little incomprehensible for me. As such, I wanted to figure out why Route 66 was so important to people, particularly considering that the highway was decommissioned in 1985 and use of the road is not the same as it was in any of its heydays. In addition, the road has changed so much that I'm trying to wrap my head around how something so different from the original can retain sufficient significance and integrity to merit listing on the National Register. Route 66 was established in 1926 to connect Chicago to Los Angeles. As you can see on the screen, the highway passed through 8 states, including Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Tourists and truck drivers were the first groups to extensively use the road, followed by economic refugees during the Great Depression. Locations along the highway were afterward used as military bases during World War II, after which the use as a tourist road was revitalized. Route 66 was extremely popular until President Eisenhower developed the U.S. Interstate Highway System in 1956. Route 66 was officially decommissioned in 1985. As the faster interstates became available for people crossing the United States, use of Route 66 decreased. Grassroots preservation societies, however, began advocating for the preservation of the highway before it was officially decommissioned. The demands for preservation were strongest in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In 1999, the National Park Service declared the highway a National Historic Corridor and allocated $10 million over a 10-year period to preserve and restore the route as necessary. The National Register nominations I worked on this summer are a continuation of the multi-state preservation efforts. One of the first questions I need to address in my thesis research is how people relate to places. Daniel Rucker put together a placemaking theory to analyze the Hopi perspectives on preservation techniques and how they alter the strategies used to stabilize archaeological sites. Placemaking suggests that humans value places that are associated with shared senses of history. Rucker explains that a shared sense of history creates a public memory by means of downplaying some versions of history, promoting patriotism and solidarity, and creating a sense of nostalgia around certain places. I want to apply this theory to Route 66 to analyze how people relate to Route 66 and the properties along the highway and why Route 66 is significant. I also want to use structuration, which Rucker used as a component of placemaking theory. Structuration is the concept that structures are both producers and product of the practices that compose a social system. Structures are essentially rules and resources that enable and restrict how societies function and how people function within them. Structuration of social systems can be used to examine how systems produce and reproduce actions and how changes in one part of a system affect other parts of the system, thereby creating change over time. I will apply this theory to preservation and integrity of historic places to analyze how the principles that govern them are negotiated as time passes. I also need to think about why preservation matters in general. I want to look at this through the lens of the French sociological tradition, particularly through the perspective of Marcel Mauss. Mauss argued that humans inherently feel an obligation or a burden to give, receive, and repay gifts. I will use the ideas Mauss presented to conceptualize preservation in the United States as part of a transaction. We preserve historic buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts because they are important, because they are reminders of a time period or specific event. Visiting those places is supposed to evoke some kind of feeling in us. We evaluate historic properties based on the magnitude of this feeling. This feeling, this association, it's the reason we consider historic properties important. When we visit places that evoke strong feelings, we feel a desire for the historic place to remain open, which prompts us to make a donation or a preservation effort. In a sense, this is a means of repaying the property or the place for making the feelings experienced at a historic property possible. A third theory that I will use in my research is heritage management theory. Heritage management theory examines what people value, who preservation serves, how preservation affects value, and different strategies for managing impacts on culturally significant places. I especially want to use heritage management theory in my research to analyze how we can manage or preserve a place that remains in use and has an environment that is continuing to change around it. After I address why places matter, why preservation is important, and how significance and meaning develop over time, I will use one of the National Register nominations I worked on during the summer as a case study to show how buildings change over time. I plan to use the Flagstaff Motel's multiple property listing to show which aspects of integrity are retained and lost, and why the properties were deemed worthy of listing on the National Register. I hope that this case study will provide a clear example of how integrity is negotiated and impacted among properties in a continually changing environment that must also meet certain safety regulations. By the time I finish analyzing Route 66, there are several questions that I want to be able to answer. The first questions I want to answer are why Route 66 is significant and how the highway is similar to and different from the route between 1926 and 1985. In addition, as Route 66 today is by no means the same as it was in the past, I want to understand how, in spite of the changes to the road and its surroundings, historic Route 66 continues to exist, how people today relate to the highway, and how it retains integrity. In conclusion, my thesis topic began at the SHPO with my exposure to 5 National Register nominations for properties along Route 66. Because the road was decommissioned and is repaved or otherwise altered as necessary, and use of the road has shifted from tourism, migration, and military to heritage tourism, I do have questions regarding whether the road has significant integrity to merit listing on the National Register. Combining my internship experience and my questions about integrity with a theoretical framework that examines why preservation matters, how places matter, and how we can manage historic places that are still in use, ultimately brought about a thesis that will examine preservation and negotiating integrity along Route 66. Thank you.
I understand that there are prehistoric foundations.
Yes.
Whatever, buried underneath, so to speak. Are you going to touch on that?
I may, but right now I'm trying to limit the scope of my project strictly to historics, just because it's a master's thesis, not my PhD, and there's only so much time I have to finish it.
3 brief suggestions. Do you know Dick and Sherry Magnon's book?
Yes, I haven't read it, but...
Regarding structuration, I suggest you go to the original source, which I think is Anthony Giddens.
Yes.
And on memorialization and that sort of thing, sites and the feelings attached to them. Jeff White, the psychocultural anthropologist, he has a good stuff on
That sounds great, thank you.
It is sort of a pilgrimage process for a lot of people.
It is.
Even so, people of all ages, actually.
And from multiple countries.
Do you have any plans to reach out to the resources around Flagstaff? It is a big deal here.
I don't have time to pull off an IRB, so I'm not going to directly interview people, but, depending on timing and, how much information I can get to, I would really like to actually go see things myself.
And there are probably meetings.
Yeah, there probably are.
Symposiums, so that might be something good. temptation is always to go like this. You gotta go like this.
Right.
It's gotta be a bound, doable, 1.5 year project.
Sean?
Question about the place picking theory. I
Mhm.
mentioned Danny. Did Danny come up with that theory, or is that something?
I think he cobbled it together.
Okay.
It's structuration, and then there's some cultural materialism and a little symbolic anthropology, and I think there's a fourth one that I forgot, but
I have another question too. Have you read Jack Kerouac?
I took a beatnik class my second semester of my undergrad, so yeah, I did not avoid that.
Easy runner.
He doesn't believe in periods. It's complicated.
When you were at the SHPO, did you get to talk about any of the economic incentives regarding nomination for the National Register and some of your opinions on that?
You mean the federal and state tax breaks?
Oh, yeah. Did you expand on that?
Yeah, one of the people I worked with, a fabulous guy, possibly more sarcastic than me, and he's in charge of the Main Streets of America program and the tax program. And so originally there were a few more state benefits because the Historic Preservation Fund received money from the lottery that the state government has now appropriated. But now, if your property is listed on the National Register, then you can receive property tax breaks from both federal and state levels. And I believe, as far as I know, all you have to do is, my property is listed, so I'm signing this form that says I want to be on the tax break.
And who normally writes the nominations for that?
Right now, people are just kind of turning them in willy-nilly. And the SHPO is actually in the process of trying to reformat this and take control. So if you want your property listed, you tell them, they find the contractor.
Yeah.
So it hopefully will get better. We received a lot of nominations this summer that don't follow the National Register nomination format. So it's a little bit of a mess right now.
I've had a couple folks that just do that as, side work and whatnot.
Yeah.
And specifically in Pennsylvania too, because there's a lot of historic structures that are being looked at. So yeah, it's an interesting avenue for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of contractors in the Phoenix and Tucson areas.
Nice. Thank you.
Of course. Jesse? Other
In an
Jesse?
earlier presentation you had given a little more information about the Oakland district and how it was possibly going to be removed from the register. And you had indicated that there was it seemed to be more of a lower income kind of neighborhood.
Yes.
And some of the issues might have been the fact that they were, the tax breaks don't apply to rental
Yes.
properties. I just kind of find it interesting, and maybe something that would be important is to look into the idea that rental properties are not allowed to be listed, yet
Mhm.
hotels are. I don't know anything more short-term rental
Yeah.
than a hotel room. So,
I think that part of it for hotels is, at least along Route 66, they were originally owner-occupied. The owner was the manager. He lived on site, so you could still argue they were owner-occupied, whereas a rental, the owner lives somewhere else. So the person who lives there is always a temporary tenant. Best guess. I really couldn't explain that one.
I mean, in segments now, or is it a huge?
It's state by state, but it's still segmented because there's only so much one contractor is going to get. I believe one of the contractors on one of the nominations I had was from Tennessee doing Arizona stuff. So
So how do you go about segmenting?
that is a very good question. Most of the actual surveys were done before I got to the SHPO, and yeah, the people in charge of the SHPO in Arizona don't necessarily champion preserving everything. So, it's just a really it's kind of complex at the Arizona SHPO, and only certain people know exactly how things happen because your archaeologists are all Section 106. So if you want to know exactly what happens, you go to Bill Collins. Bill Collins doesn't work in office every day of the week. So there are some things I didn't quite get to, but that's probably something I should find out. Anybody else? Thank you.